Now let's turn to the issue of trade barriers and protectionism. To better understand the politics of protectionism, let us return in our time machine to another meeting between David Ricardo and the European trade ministers. It is now 2 years after these trade ministers voiced their support for free trade, and since that time, there has been a flood of American food imports into Europe. While the European clothing industry has grown dramatically and is experiencing record profits because of heavy exports to America, thousands of European farmers have been put out of work. This unemployment has provoked political unrest, and newspapers from farm districts around Europe have fanned the flames of discontent. They have written scathing editorials calling for voters to throw out the political rascals and replace them with leaders who will protect the European economy by supporting strict quotas on American food imports. In fact, this is an age-old problem faced by political leaders who support free trade. Even though free trade can provide benefits to all countries and create thousands of jobs in export industries, it can just as easily destroy jobs domestically in import-competing industries. Given the enormous political pressures that can build for protectionism, it is useful for us to analyze the two most common ways of restricting trade: tariffs and quotas. And as I do this, I want you to ponder this question. Why, from a political perspective, are quotas often preferred to tariffs? This figure illustrates the domestic market for food in Europe. You can see that equilibrium occurs at point A at a price of 8 and quantity of 200. Now, suppose that food is available in an unlimited amount from the rest of the world at a price of $4 per unit. How might you represent this in our figure? The world supply curve would be represented by this red horizontal line. Now, given this line, what will be the price of food to European consumers, the quantity of American imports, the value of those imports, and the level of domestic production? In the absence of any transport costs, the food price in Europe must be equal to the world price of $4. And at this price, you can see that domestic European production is measured by the line segment BC and will be 100 units, considerably less than before free trade. At the same time, American imports are measured by the line segment CD and are equal to 200 units. And revenues from the sale of these imports are equal to the shaded area CDEF. Now let's suppose that the farmers and their lobbyists are able to successfully lobby the European trade ministers to impose a tariff of $2 per unit of imports, wherein a tariff is a tax levied on imports. What happens now to domestic production and imports in this figure, and who wins and loses? Clearly, domestic producers win because their production not only rises by 50 units, but their profits rise by the shaded area BCHG. Equally clearly, European food consumers lose not only because the price of food rises from $4 to $6, but also because they consume 50 less units of food. In fact, the total loss to consumers is measured by the area BDIG. But there are two more players in this game, one winner and one loser. Who are they, and what do they win, and what do they lose? The other big loser is the American food industry, which now exports 100 fewer units and loses revenues equal to the shaded areas C, J, L, E, and KDMF. And the other big winner is none other than the European governments that imposed the tariff. They collect tariff revenues equal to the area HIJK. From a political perspective, what is perhaps most interesting about this figure is this. A relatively small handful of people in one domestic industry, farming, has gained a considerable profit at the expense of a much larger but politically less powerful group, namely food consumers. But also note that this protectionist tariff has also considerably harmed food producers in America, and this group is unlikely to remain silent on the tariff question. In fact, one likely result is that pressure will build politically in America to retaliate against European food tariffs with protectionist tariffs of its own, say on European clothing imports. There may, however, be a way for Europe to avert this trade war. Can you tell me why replacing the European tariff on food with an equivalent European quota might be a viable political solution? And by the way, a quota is an explicit quantity limit on imports. An equivalent quota in this case would be a 100-unit limit on American food, since that is the level of imports after the $2 per unit tariff. Now let me give you a hint as to how you might think about this political question. Look carefully at our figure and think about how one of our big losers from the tariff would become a big winner with a quota. Under a tariff, the shaded area, HIKJ, goes to the European governments in the form of tariff revenues. However, under a quota, foreign exporters, in this case American food producers, will be able to capture these revenues. And in many cases, these additional revenues will largely offset their losses from selling fewer exports. The result in America will be far less political pressure from food producers for retaliatory tariffs. Now, before we leave this figure, there's one more thing I want to show you, namely the efficiency or deadweight loss associated with the imposition of a tariff or quota. In fact, the loss is the same regardless of whether a tariff or quota is used. Look carefully at the figure now. Can you figure out which areas of the figure represent the deadweight loss and why? The shaded area, CHJ, represents the loss in producer surplus. In this case, too many European resources are being diverted into the inefficient production of food at the expense of production in other sectors. At the same time, the shaded area KID represents the loss in consumer surplus, the loss in consumer satisfaction from consuming fewer units of food. Together, the two triangles measure the deadweight loss.